The Arizona sun in the year of our Lord 1879 was not a kind thing. It was a hammer, a forge, an anvil, beating down on the red earth until the heat rose in shimmering waves that made a lyre out of the horizon. It baked the life from the land, leaving behind a skeleton of cracked dirt, skeletal cacti, and mountains that clawed at a bleached white sky. This was the world Evelyn Carter had chosen, or perhaps the world that had been chosen for her. At 24, with a mind full of books and a heart full of a quiet, stubborn hope, she had left the gentle green hills of Missouri behind for this furnace. She was a teacher, and she carried her belief in letters and numbers like a shield against the vast, brutal emptiness of the territory. She was bound for a fledgling settlement, a place called Providence, where the children of miners and homesteaders were said to be growing up as wild as the sagebrush. The wagon train was a small one, just 3 heavy carts and a handful of outriders, a tiny island of humanity crawling across an ocean of dust. For days, the journey had been a monotonous rhythm of creaking wheels and the plodding hoofbeats of tired mules. Evelyn sat perched on the driver's seat of her own small buckboard, a gift from her father, packed with her few worldly possessions, a heavy trunk of clothes, a box of primers and slates, and a small, leather-bound collection of poems she knew by heart. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down, drawing the moisture from her skin and leaving a fine grit of dust in her throat. She had tied a kerchief over the lower half of her face, but it did little to stop the incessant powder that coated everything in a layer of rust-colored grime. She looked at the men of the train, their faces leathered by the sun, their eyes narrowed to slits against the glare, and felt a familiar pang of isolation. They were kind enough, in a gruff, distant way, but she was an outsider, a bookwoman in a land of grit and survival. The sky began to change in the late afternoon. The relentless blue faded to a sickly yellow-brown at the edges, a bruise spreading across the heavens. The wind, which had been a hot, steady breath, began to pick up, whipping in erratic gusts that stung the eyes and stole the breath. The lead rider, a man named Silas with a beard stained by tobacco, reined in his horse and squinted at the horizon. He shouted something that the wind tore apart and scattered. The mules grew nervous, their ears twitching, their tails lashing. Evelyn gripped the reins tighter, her knuckles white. The world was darkening, not with the gentle descent of evening, but with an angry, churning gloom. Then the wall of dust hit them. It was not like the dust that had plagued them for weeks. This was a solid thing, a moving mountain of sand and earth that swallowed the light and sound. The world vanished into a maelstrom of roaring wind and stinging grit. Evelyn could see nothing beyond the terrified, wide eyes of her own horse. The air was thick, suffocating, each breath a painful mouthful of dirt. The other wagons, the riders, Silas, they were all gone, erased by the storm. Her horse, a normally placid gelding named Patches, panicked. He screamed, a high, terrified sound that was almost lost in the howl of the wind, and bolted. Evelyn was thrown back against the hard seat. The reins ripped from her hands. She scrambled for purchase, her fingers clawing at the rough wood, but it was no use. Patches was blind with terror, running from the suffocating darkness, from the noise that was like the end of the world. The buckboard bucked and swayed, a rudderless ship in a furious sea. She could feel the ground beneath the wheels becoming uneven, treacherous. There was a sudden, violent lurch as a wheel caught on a rock, followed by the sharp, sickening crack of splintering wood. The world tilted sideways. Evelyn was flung from the seat, her head striking something hard. For a brief, starburst moment of pain, she saw the dark underbelly of the wagon flipping over her before the brown, swirling chaos gave way to a deeper, more absolute blackness. Consciousness returned not as a rush, but as a slow, painful trickle. The first thing she was aware of was a profound silence. The roaring of the storm had ceased. The world was still. The second was a dull, throbbing ache in her temple. She tried to lift a hand to touch the sore spot, but her limbs felt heavy, disconnected. She managed to peel her eyelids open. The light was dim, filtered. She was not outside. She was lying on a bed of soft furs inside a circular structure made of earth and wood. The air smelled of wood smoke, herbs, and something else, something unfamiliar and deeply human. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through the fog in her mind. This was not the wagon. This was not Providence. She pushed herself up on her elbows, ignoring the dizzying spin of the room. It was a hogan. She had seen drawings of them in a book about the territories. She was in a Navajo camp. She scrambled off the furs, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her dress was torn and filthy, her hair a tangled mess, but she seemed to be otherwise unharmed, save for the lump on her head and a collection of scrapes along her arms. She stumbled toward the covered opening, pushed aside the heavy hide flap, and stepped out into the dying light of the evening. The world outside was alien and terrifying. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the landscape sculpted anew. The camp was nestled in a small, protected canyon, a collection of hogans scattered amongst the red rock formations. A central fire pit glowed with embers, and the smell of roasting meat now mingled with the wood smoke. But it was the people who made her breath catch in her throat. They were everywhere, their dark eyes turning to fix on her as she emerged. Women stopped their work, their hands still in baskets of corn. Children who had been playing in the dust froze, their laughter dying on their lips. Men, lean and hard-looking, with long black hair tied back, straightened up, their faces unreadable masks. They formed a loose, silent circle around her, their gazes heavy with suspicion, with a deep, ingrained weariness that spoke of long suffering. They did not move toward her, but their stillness was more menacing than any threat. Evelyn stood frozen, a lone, pale figure in a sea of copper skin and dark eyes. Every terrible story she had ever heard about Indian raids, about captives and massacres, flooded her mind. She thought she was going to die, here, in this hidden canyon. Miles from anyone who knew her name, her life would end. She was trembling, a visible tremor that shook her from head to toe, and she wrapped her arms around herself, a useless gesture of self-preservation. The circle of people parted then, making way for a man who walked toward her from the shadows of a large rock outcropping. He was taller than the others, with broad shoulders and a presence that commanded attention without a single word. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his moccasins making no sound on the packed earth. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest and arms bare, revealing skin the color of rich earth, laced with the lean muscle of a man who lived a hard life. A long, thin scar, pale against his darker skin, cut a path from the corner of his left eye down across his cheekbone, a permanent mark of violence. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were as dark and deep as a desert night, and just as cold. They held no pity, no curiosity, only a flat, chilling emptiness that seemed to reflect all the pain the world had to offer. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her torn dress, her pale, terrified face. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Evelyn felt a scream building in her throat, a wild, animal sound of pure fear. She had to say something, anything to break the spell, to prove she was not a threat. The words tumbled out of her, a desperate, breathless plea. "I did not mean to crash into your camp." The sound of her own voice, high and thin in the vast quiet, shocked her. The man's expression did not change. Not a flicker of emotion crossed his stoic features. He simply looked at her, the woman who had literally fallen out of the sky and into his world. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together deep beneath the earth. The English was perfect, devoid of any accent, which was somehow more unsettling than if he had spoken in his own tongue. "Then you must be the unluckiest woman this side of the canyon." It was not a question. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a profound, soul-deep weariness. And in that moment, as Evelyn Carter, the schoolteacher from Missouri, stood facing Talon Yazzie, the Navajo warrior who had lost everything, neither of them knew that the runaway wagon and the furious storm had been nothing but the clumsy hands of fate, shoving their two broken worlds together. They only knew the fear, the suspicion, and the vast, unbridgeable distance that separated them under the newly washed, star-filled Arizona sky. They did not drag her or bind her, but the walk back to the hogan was a journey through 1,000 hostile eyes. The man named Talon walked just behind her, his presence a heavy weight at her back, a silent promise of force should she think of running. She was led back into the dim circular dwelling and the hide flap was dropped, plunging her into near darkness, the only light coming from a small smoke hole in the roof. She sank onto the pile of furs, her legs giving way, and drew her knees to her chest. The fear was a living thing inside her, a cold, coiling serpent in her belly. She was a prisoner. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant sound from the camp a prelude to violence. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time had lost its shape. The flap was pushed aside, and Talon entered, ducking his tall frame to pass through the low doorway. He carried a clay bowl of water in one hand and a small pouch in the other. He set the bowl down on the packed earth floor near her, the sound loud in the quiet hogan. He did not speak. He knelt, opened the pouch, and took out a poultice of crushed green leaves that smelled sharp and medicinal. Evelyn flinched away from him, pressing herself against the curved wall. "Do not touch me," she whispered, her voice trembling. His dark eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something other than cold emptiness in them. It was annoyance, a flicker of impatience. "Your head is bleeding," he said, his voice low and flat. "Or would you prefer to let it fester?" He made no move, waiting. The choice was hers. Her hand went to her temple, and her fingers came away sticky and dark. The logical part of her mind, the teacher's mind that valued sense and reason, warred with the primal terror that screamed at her to shrink away from this dangerous stranger. Slowly, hesitantly, she lowered her hand and bowed her head slightly, a gesture of reluctant submission. He moved with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch as he cleaned the wound with a damp cloth was surprisingly gentle. He applied the poultice, the coolness of it a blessed relief against the throbbing ache, and then secured it with a strip of soft leather. His proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of dust and leather and something uniquely him, something wild and clean like the desert after a rain. When he was done, he sat back on his heels. "Why am I here?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why are you keeping me?" "You fell into our world," he answered, his gaze distant, as if looking at something far beyond the walls of the hogan. "We must decide what to do with you." "I am not a threat. I am a teacher. I was on my way to a town called Providence." A bitter, humorless smile touched his lips for a fleeting second, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Many of your people come here. They do not bring books. They bring guns, and they bring misery." His voice hardened, the gravelly edge sharpening. "Not 2 weeks ago, men from the fort rode into a summer camp north of here. They were looking for warriors. They found only women and old men. It did not stop them from burning the lodges and taking what they wanted." The serpent of fear in Evelyn's stomach tightened its coils. She now understood the depth of the suspicion in their eyes. She was not just a woman who had crashed her wagon. She was the face of an enemy, a symbol of the violence that had shattered their lives. A wave of despair washed over her. How could she convince them of her innocence when she looked so much like their tormentors? "I am not one of them," she said, the words feeling small and useless. "I would never. I believe all people deserve to live in peace." Talon looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face, looking for the lie. "Words are wind," he said finally, rising to his feet. They blow away and leave nothing behind. We will watch you. We will see what is in your heart, not just on your tongue." He left the bowl of water and disappeared through the flap, leaving her alone once more with her fear and his chilling words. The days that followed were a kind of waking purgatory. Talon was her constant shadow. He was her guard, her keeper, the silent arbiter of her small world. She was not harmed, but she was not free. She was allowed out of the hogan during the day, but she could not stray beyond the sight of the camp. He was always there, leaning against a rock, mending a leather strap, his eyes missing nothing. The other people of the village, the Dine, as she was beginning to understand they called themselves, continued to watch her with a mixture of fear and contempt. The women would turn their backs when she approached, gathering their children close as if she carried a disease. Yet, in this crucible of mistrust, small, unexpected moments of humanity began to surface. Talon would bring her food twice a day, usually a simple corn cake and a piece of roasted rabbit or venison. He never spoke when he did so, simply leaving the wooden plate near her and walking away. But she noticed the food was always warm. One afternoon, as the sun beat down with a particular ferocity, she saw him leave a full water skin in the shade of the hogan for her. He did it without looking at her, a gesture performed as if he did not want to be caught in the act of kindness. She began to see things differently. Too, her fear, while ever present, was slowly being tempered by observation. She saw the way the women worked together, their hands moving deftly as they wove intricate patterns into blankets, their low voices a constant, murmuring song. She watched the men treat their horses with a respect that bordered on reverence. This was not a band of savages from a penny dreadful novel. This was a community, a family, bound together by tradition and a deep, spiritual connection to the harsh land they called home. She saw them treat the earth not as a thing to be conquered, but as a mother to be honored. They wasted nothing. Every part of an animal was used, every drop of water cherished. It was a stark contrast to the casual wastefulness she had witnessed among the settlers. Her inner world was in turmoil. Everything she had been taught, every prejudice she had unknowingly carried with her from the East, was being challenged. These were not the people from the stories. They were people who had suffered, who were grieving, and who had every reason to hate her. And yet, the man assigned to watch her, the man whose family, she suspected, had been lost to the very violence he spoke of, left water for her in the shade. It was a contradiction she could not reconcile. Talon, too, was fighting his own battle. He had been given the task of watching the white woman because the elders trusted his judgment, and because his heart was considered the hardest in the camp. He had seen his wife and young daughter cut down in a raid years ago, a memory that was a constant, raw wound in his soul. He had sworn to never again feel anything but hatred for her kind. But this woman, she was different. He watched her when she thought no one was looking. He saw the way she spoke softly to a stray dog that wandered into the camp, offering it a piece of her own meager meal. He saw the way she sat for hours, simply watching the clouds drift across the vast sky, her face not filled with the boredom he expected, but with a quiet sense of wonder. She never complained. She never wept, at least not where anyone could see. She possessed a strange, quiet strength he had not anticipated. He had expected arrogance, demands, fear that would curdle into shrill hysterics. He found none of it. He found a woman who was terrified. Yes, but who met her terror with a quiet dignity that pricked at the edges of his hardened heart. He was a warrior, trained to see threats, to anticipate danger. And the greatest danger this woman posed, he was beginning to realize, was not to his people, but to the fortress of hate he had built around his own spirit. One evening, as the sky bled into deep purples and oranges, a profound loneliness settled over Evelyn. She missed the green fields of her home, the familiar comfort of her own small room, the weight of a book in her hands. She was an alien in an alien land, and the ache of it was a physical pain. Without thinking, she began to hum, a soft, simple tune her mother used to sing to her when she was a child. a lullaby about fireflies and sleeping meadows. The melody was a fragile thread connecting her to a world that felt a lifetime away. She closed her eyes, and the humming turned into quiet singing, the English words feeling strange and foreign on her tongue in this place. "Hush now, little darling, the sun has gone to sleep." She did not know she had an audience. A few of the camp's children, drawn by the strange, gentle music, had crept near the hogan. They peeked around the corner, their dark, curious eyes wide. They were the same children who had been pulled away from her, who had been taught to fear her. But the song held no threat. It was soft, sad, and beautiful. A little girl, no older than 5, smiled, a flash of white teeth in her dusty face. A boy nudged his friend, and a suppressed giggle broke the evening stillness. From the shadows near the canyon wall, Talon watched. He saw the children, their initial suspicion melting away, replaced by a simple, innocent curiosity. He heard the woman's song, the melody weaving a spell of peace that settled over the tense camp. The notes pierced through the layers of his grief and anger, finding a place deep inside him that he thought had died long ago. He remembered his own little girl, her laughter like the sound of bells. He remembered his wife, singing softly as she ground corn. The song was a painful reminder of all he had lost, but it was also something else. It was a flicker of light in a long, dark night. Seeing the children smile at the sound of her voice, seeing the supposed enemy create a moment of gentle beauty in the heart of his grieving camp. He felt something shift within him. The ice around his heart did not melt, not entirely, but a single, hairline crack appeared, and through it, a dangerous warmth began to seep in. He looked at the woman sitting in the dust, her song a prayer to a home she might never see again. And for the first time, he did not see a white woman. He saw a soul as lost and lonely as his own. The fragile peace Evelyn's song had woven was torn apart by the thunder of a single horse. A rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon, his pony lathered in sweat, its sides heaving. He was a young scout, his face a mask of dust and grim news. He spoke in the flowing, guttural sounds of the Dine language, his words urgent and sharp. Evelyn could not understand the sounds, but she understood the effect they had. A wave of alarm rippled through the camp. The women gathered their children, their faces tight with a familiar dread. The men moved to the central fire, their hands instinctively going to the knives at their belts or the rifles leaning against their hogans. Talon had been standing in the shadows, but now he strode into the firelight, his face hard as the surrounding rock. He listened intently to the scout, his body rigid. Evelyn watched him, a cold knot of apprehension forming in her stomach. Though she was an outsider, she could feel the shift in the air, the return of the suffocating tension that had greeted her on her first day. The camp, which had begun to feel like a place of people, once again felt like a cage of enemies. The scout gestured in her direction. Every eye in the camp turned to her, and the suspicion was back, 100 times stronger than before. It was a physical force, pressing in on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She was the cause. She knew it as certainly as she knew her own name. The soldiers were coming. The scout had brought news of blue uniforms moving through the territory, and her presence here, at this exact time, was a coincidence no one was willing to accept. She was a spy, a scout, the bait in a trap. Later, as the sun dipped below the canyon rim, casting long, menacing shadows, Talon came to her. He did not bring food. He stood in the opening of the hogan, a tall, dark silhouette against the fiery sky. "They want to give you to the soldiers," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Or kill you before the soldiers find the camp. They are deciding which is the safer path." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "But I have done nothing. I have told you the truth." "The truth is a luxury we cannot afford," he said, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her. A white woman appears from a storm. Days later, soldiers appear from the dust. "To my people. This is not coincidence. It is a pattern they have seen written in the blood of their families too many times. He was turning to leave when an old man, his face a web of deep wrinkles and his hair as white as winter snow, approached the hogan. He walked with the aid of a crooked staff, but his back was straight and his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He was Hastian, the elder of this small band, a man revered for his wisdom and feared for his unyielding will. He ignored Evelyn completely. His eyes fixed on Talon. He spoke in their language, his voice raspy with age but carrying an undeniable authority. Talon answered, his tone respectful but firm. Their exchange was short, but it felt as heavy as a death sentence. Evelyn watched, helpless, as the two men spoke of her fate. She saw the conflict in Talon's jaw, the tight line of his mouth. She saw the intractable certainty in the old chief's eyes. As Hastian turned to leave, he paused and looked at Talon, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second with something that might have been affection, or perhaps pity. He spoke one last time, his voice low. Evelyn did not need to understand the language to feel the power of his words. Then he was gone, a ghost melting back into the twilight. Talon remained for a moment, his back to her. When he finally turned, the emptiness in his eyes seemed vast enough to swallow the entire desert. He was the one who taught me how to track, how to fight, he said, his voice a near whisper. He was like a father to me after mine was gone. What did he say? Evelyn asked, her throat tight. Talon looked at her then, and the coldness in his gaze was a new kind of pain. He reminded me of a lesson he taught me long ago. He paused, and the words fell like stones into the silence. Mercy kills faster than bullets. He left her then, and the weight of the old man's words settled over her. Mercy kills faster than bullets. It was a brutal piece of wisdom, born from a brutal world. To show her mercy, to let her live, could be the act that brought destruction down upon them all. And Talon was standing against that wisdom. He was standing against his own mentor, his own people, to protect her. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. She was not just a prisoner he was assigned to guard. She had become his responsibility, his burden, and that burden might cost him his life. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle of the wind, every distant cry of a coyote, sounded like an approaching executioner. She lay on the furs, her mind racing. She could not let Talon suffer for her. She could not be the cause of a rift between him and the people he was sworn to protect. A desperate plan began to form in her mind, a seed of an idea that was both terrifying and necessary. She had to leave. If she disappeared, if she was simply gone, then the threat she posed would be gone with her. They would assume she had fled, and Talon would be absolved of his duty. She would be taking her chances with the desert, but her chances here had dwindled to nothing. When the moon was high and the camp was wrapped in a deep, exhausted sleep, she moved. She slipped out of the hogan as silently as a shadow. The central fire was a bed of glowing red embers, casting a faint, demonic light on the sleeping forms around it. She crept toward the edge of the camp, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had saved a small piece of corn cake from her last meal and had managed to secure a water skin that was half full. It was not much, but it would have to be enough. She reached the edge of the rock formations that encircled the camp and began to climb, her worn shoes slipping on the smooth, cool stone. The air was thin and cold. Below her, the camp was a collection of dark mounds. Above her, the sky was a black velvet blanket strewn with an impossible number of stars. For a moment, she felt a dizzying sense of freedom. Then, a hand closed around her arm. She gasped, a small, strangled sound, and spun around. Talon was there, emerging from the blackness of a crevice as if he were part of the rock itself. He had made no sound. His grip was like iron. "Let me go," she hissed, trying to pull away. "I am saving you. They will not blame you if I am gone." "And where will you go?" he asked, his voice a low, angry growl. He pulled her down from the rock and onto the sandy ground at the base of the canyon wall. "The desert does not care if your heart is pure. it will kill you all the same. The heat will bake the sense from your mind by noon tomorrow. The snakes and the scorpions will find you before nightfall. Or perhaps the soldiers will find you first. Do you think they will be kind? It is better than waiting here to be killed, she cried, her voice cracking with desperation and fear. It is better than watching them turn on you because of me. You know nothing, he snarled, his face close to hers, his dark eyes blazing with a fire she had never seen before. You think your death would solve anything? It would only prove to them that you were guilty, that you ran because you were a spy. He took her other arm, his grip hard, forcing her to face him in the pale moonlight. You crashed once, you die twice. His words hung in the air between them, sharp and final. Before she could answer, a strange sound began, a low moaning that seemed to come from the earth itself. The wind was rising. It whipped her hair across her face and carried the sharp scent of dust. The stars began to disappear, one by one, blotted out by a rapidly advancing darkness. A storm, Talon said, his anger momentarily forgotten as he scanned the horizon. A bad one. Come. He pulled her along, half running, away from the camp and deeper into the network of rocks and canyons. The wind howled now, a living entity that screamed and tore at them, flinging sand that stung their skin like 1,000 tiny needles. The world dissolved into a brown, churning chaos, a perfect mirror of the turmoil in Evelyn's own heart. She could not see. She could only hold on to the unyielding grip of Talon's hand as he guided her through the maelstrom. He found what he was looking for, a deep overhang, a hollowed-out space behind a massive boulder that offered some protection from the direct assault of the wind. He pushed her into the small space and then crowded in behind her, his body pressing against hers, shielding her from the worst of the storm. The space was tight, forcing them into an intimacy that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Her back was pressed against the hard wall of his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. The roar of the wind was deafening. The air was thick with flying sand. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face against the rough buckskin of Talon's leggings. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tighter against him, his one hand coming up to shield her head. It was a purely instinctual act of protection, a man shielding a woman from the fury of the elements. But in that small, dark space, with the world being ripped apart around them, it was more than that. It was the first time anyone had held her with such strength, such absolute grounding solidity. She was a small, fragile thing in his arms, and yet, for the first time since her wagon had crashed, she felt safe. She could feel his breath, hot and quick, against the sensitive skin of her neck as he turned his head to shield his own face from the biting sand. The sensation sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. In the midst of chaos and fear, a different kind of storm was raging inside her, a whirlwind of confusion and a strange, undeniable pull toward the man who held her. He was her captor, her enemy, the man whose people wanted her dead, and yet here he was, his body a living shield, his breath a warm promise of life against her skin. The chasm between their two worlds, which had seemed so vast and impossible to cross, suddenly felt no wider than a single, shared breath. As the storm raged, they huddled together, two lost souls clinging to one another in the dark. And they both knew, without a single word being spoken, that nothing would ever be the same again. The storm died as suddenly as it had been born. The roaring wind fell away to a whisper, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. The air was cool and tasted of clean, damp earth. In their small refuge behind the boulder, the world slowly came back into focus. Evelyn was intensely aware of Talon's body, the solid wall of his back against her front, the steady beat of his heart that she had felt through the peak of the tempest. His arms were still around her, a protective cage. He did not move for a long moment, as if listening to the desert's new stillness. Then he released her, and the sudden loss of his warmth was a shock. He moved out from behind the rock, his form a dark shape against the moon, which was now visible through a haze of settling dust. The landscape was transformed, the dunes and drifts of sand sculpted into new, unfamiliar shapes. He looked back at her, his face unreadable in the gloom. He told her they could not go back. The storm would have covered their tracks, but it would not hide them for long. Hastian would send scouts at first light. They needed to find a better place to wait, a place no one would think to look. He led her through the transformed landscape, moving with a certainty that was both comforting and deeply alien. He was a part of this world in a way she could never be, reading its signs in the curve of a dune, the shape of a rock. They walked for what felt like miles, descending into a narrow, winding wash where the high rock walls offered protection from the wind. He finally stopped in a small, bowl-shaped clearing, almost a natural room, with a sandy floor and a sheer cliff face on one side. It felt hidden. It felt safe. He told her they needed a fire. He gathered dry twigs and branches from the base of a skeletal mesquite tree that had been scoured by the storm, his movements economical and precise. He brought the small pile of wood to the center of the clearing and knelt. He gestured for her to come closer. He explained, his voice a low murmur against the desert's quiet, that you did not simply command fire to appear. You invited it. You built it a home, a small structure of the tiniest, driest twigs, leaving a space for it to breathe. He showed her how to use a fire drill, a simple stick and a flat piece of wood, his hands guiding hers as she learned to apply the steady, patient pressure. His touch was rough but sure, sending a jolt through her that had nothing to do with their task. Finally, a tiny wisp of smoke appeared, then a glowing ember. He gently transferred it to a bundle of dry grass, blowing on it with a soft, controlled breath until it burst into a small, bright flame. The fire grew, a living thing in the center of their small world. It pushed back the immense darkness of the desert and the lingering chill of the storm. They sat on opposite sides of the flames, the light flickering across their faces, casting dancing shadows on the rock walls behind them. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was not the silence of fear and mistrust, but a shared quiet, a space to breathe. Ooh. He pointed to the sky. Now, a vast expanse of brilliant, shimmering stars. He began to speak, his voice losing some of its hard edge as he named the constellations, not with the Greek and Roman names she knew, but with the names his people had given them. He showed her the first man and the first woman, the great rabbit, and the path of the spirits. He taught her how to find the star that does not move, the one that could guide a lost traveler home. She listened, mesmerized, feeling the world expand around her. He was not just teaching her how to navigate the desert. He was showing her a universe she had never known existed, a sky filled with stories and meaning. Perhaps it was the warmth of the fire, or the vastness of the sky, but something inside her felt safe enough to unfurl. She found herself speaking, her voice soft in the quiet night. She told him about Missouri, about the suffocating expectations of her small town. She spoke of her father, a kind man who believed a woman's mind was a thing to be cultivated, and of the townspeople who looked at her with pity and suspicion because she preferred books to bonnets and scholarly debate to quilting bees. She confessed that she was considered an oddity, a woman too educated for her own good, one who had stubbornly refused two perfectly acceptable offers of marriage, choosing instead to chase a foolish dream of teaching in a wild, untamed land. She had been lonely there, too, an outsider in her own home. He listened without interruption, his dark eyes fixed on her face, reflecting the firelight. When she finished, the silence stretched again, but it was filled with a new understanding. He looked into the flames, his expression distant, his jaw tight. He began to speak of his sister. Her name was Shadi, which meant sunshine. He said her laughter was like the sound of a running stream, and that she had been wilder and braver than any of the boys. He did not speak of the raid in detail, but he did not need to. The pain was etched into every word. He spoke of the color of the sky that day, a perfect, cloudless blue. He remembered the smell of the piñon smoke from his mother's cooking fire, and he remembered the soldiers, their blue coats like a plague against the red earth. He had been away, hunting. When he returned, the world was smoke and silence. He found Shadi near the stream where she had loved to play. She was wearing the turquoise beads he had given her for her 14th naming day. The memory was a raw, open wound, and as he spoke, he was not a fearsome warrior, but a boy who had lost his son. In the flickering light of the fire, Evelyn saw him clearly for the first time. The hard lines of his face, the scar, the coldness in his eyes, they were not the man himself, but the armor he wore to protect a heart that had been shattered. They were two lonely people, two souls scarred by worlds that did not understand them, worlds that had taken from them the things they loved most. She was an outcast by choice, he by tragedy. The chasm between them, the one of culture and race and history, seemed to vanish, burned away by the simple, powerful heat of shared pain. He fell silent, his gaze lost in the hypnotic dance of the flames. She saw a tremor in his hand as he rested it on his knee. Without thinking, she rose and walked around the fire, her bare feet silent on the cool sand. She knelt in front of him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin. She did not know what she intended to do, what comfort she could possibly offer. She only knew that the space between them had become unbearable. She reached out, her hand hesitant, and touched his. His skin was rough, his knuckles calloused, but he did not pull away. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a universe of sorrow. She saw the surprise there, and something else, something vulnerable and uncertain. His other hand came up, slowly, as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. He cupped her jaw, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. His touch was electric, a spark that leaped from his skin to hers. She could feel the slight tremble in his fingers, a silent confession of the storm raging within him. He leaned in, his gaze never leaving hers, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion or demand, but one of profound, aching tenderness. It was hesitant, questioning, a soft brush of warmth in the cold desert night. It tasted of wood smoke and sorrow, and a desperate, unspoken longing for life in that single, fragile moment. There was no white woman and no Navajo warrior. There were only two people, finding a refuge in one another. When he pulled back, the world seemed to hold its breath. She looked at him, at the man who had been her captor and was now her savior, and a single, powerful thought bloomed in her mind, as clear and bright as the stars above. She had crashed into a Navajo camp by mistake. That was an accident of fate. But this moment, this man choosing to keep her from harm, hiding her in the desert, sharing the fire of his own broken heart with her. This was a choice, and in the quiet depths of his eyes, she saw that it was a choice he had made to keep her safe forever. The fire crackled, the desert watched, and a promise was made without a single word being spoken. The dawn that followed their night by the secret campfire was stark and beautiful. The sky was a pale, clean slate, and the air held a crystalline chill. The fire had died to a pile of soft gray ash, and the world felt scrubbed new by the storm. Evelyn awoke to find Talon already awake, standing on a small rise above their hidden valley, a motionless silhouette against the rising sun. A blanket, one she had not seen before, was draped over her shoulders. He must have retrieved it from the wreckage of her buckboard, a silent act of care that made her heart ache with a strange, new tenderness. The peace of the morning did not last. Talon suddenly stiffened, his head cocked. Listening to something she could not hear, he moved with the swift, silent grace of a predator, gesturing for her to stay down as he crept to the edge of the wash and peered over. After a long moment, he slid back down, his face a grim mask. The lines of exhaustion and pain from the previous night were gone, replaced by the sharp, focused intensity of a warrior. He told her they were being tracked. He had heard the distant sound of shod horses, the metallic ring against rock that was the signature of the cavalry. He said the storm had not been enough. Someone, a skilled tracker, had found their trail. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a terrible resolve. He would not be taken, and he would not let them take her. He led her from the wash, moving quickly now, his long strides forcing her into a near run to keep up. He did not speak, his entire being concentrated on the path ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the rocks and ridges around them. He led her to a hidden box canyon where two small, wiry ponies stood grazing, their coats the color of the dry earth. They were hobbled loosely, left there for an emergency. This was that emergency. As he worked to remove the hobbles, Evelyn looked back the way they had come. On a distant mesa, she saw them, a line of dark figures on horseback, small as insects against the vast landscape, blue uniforms, her breath caught in her throat. Talon saw the direction of her gaze and his jaw tightened. He moved to the ponies, his movements swift and sure. He threw a simple blanket pad over one and helped her mount, his hands strong and firm on her waist as he lifted her. The brief touch sent a wave of heat through her, a startling contrast to the cold fear gripping her heart. As he swung himself onto the other pony, she saw the leader of the patrol more clearly through the clean desert air. He had a spyglass to his eye. He lowered it, and even from this distance, she recognized him. Lieutenant Miller, a man she had met briefly at Fort Defiance, where her wagon train had stopped for supplies. He had been charming on the surface, but his eyes had held a proprietary gleam that had made her skin crawl. He had made it clear he considered a woman with her education and looks wasted on a dusty settlement of miners. He had promised to visit Providence, a promise that had sounded more like a threat. And now, here he was. This was no random patrol. He was hunting for her. Talon saw the look of recognition on her face. He asked her who it was. She told him, her voice a strained whisper. A muscle worked in his jaw. This changed everything. It was no longer a matter of evasion. It was a pursuit led by a man with a personal motive, a man who would not give up easily. They rode hard. The small ponies surprisingly swift and sure-footed, navigating the treacherous terrain with an instinct that left Evelyn breathless. But the soldiers had larger, stronger horses, and they were gaining. The distant pop of a rifle shot echoed through the canyon, the bullet whining off a rock far to their left. Talon made a decision. He reined in his pony in the shadow of a tall spire of rock and slid to the ground. He pulled a revolver from a leather holster tucked into his waistband, a weapon she had not known he carried. It was old, the metal worn smooth with use. He pressed the heavy gun into her hand, closing her trembling fingers around the grip. He told her there was a narrow canyon just ahead, a place where the ponies could pass, but the larger cavalry horses would be slowed. He told her to ride through it and not stop, not for any reason. He said he would draw them off, lead them west. His voice was calm, a steady rock in her swirling sea of panic. But she saw the truth in his eyes. It was a suicide mission. He was sacrificing himself for her. "No," she said, shaking her head, trying to give the gun back. "I will not leave you." "You will," he said, his voice hard, his fingers pressing hers firmly against the cold metal of the revolver. "You will ride, and you will not look back. It is the only way." He looked at her then, his eyes burning into hers. And for a second, the warrior fell away, and she saw only the man who had shared his fire, his stories, his soul with her. "Live, Evelyn," he whispered, the sound a raw prayer. He touched her cheek, a fleeting, tender caress, and then he was gone, his pony scrambling up a steep, rocky incline, a single, defiant figure against the enormous sky. She did what he said. She kicked her pony into a gallop, her heart shattering with every hoofbeat that took her farther away from him. She found the narrow canyon, a tight, twisting slit in the rock, and plunged into its shadows. The sound of the pursuit faded. replaced by the echo of her pony's hooves and her own ragged breathing. She was safe. She had escaped. And she had never felt more alone or more cowardly in her entire life. The sounds of gunfire erupted behind her, a series of sharp cracks that echoed ominously down the canyon walls. One shot, then another, a volley. She pictured Talon, alone against a dozen soldiers. She saw Lieutenant Miller's smug, possessive face. She saw Talon's body, broken and bleeding on the red sand. The image was so vivid, so unbearable, that a cry of anguish was torn from her throat. His final word to her had been, "Live." But what kind of life would it be, bought at the cost of a life of guilt, of looking over her shoulder, of remembering the man who had shown her a universe in the stars and then died for her? No, she could not do it. Mercy kills faster than bullets. Hastien had said, but a life without honor, a life bought with cowardice, was not mercy. It was its own kind of death. She reined in the pony so hard it reared, its whinny of protest a shrill cry in the narrow space. She turned it around, her knuckles white on the reins, the heavy weight of the revolver in her other hand a cold, terrifying reality. She was a teacher. Her hands were meant for books and chalk, not for weapons. But the woman who had left Missouri was gone, left behind in the dust of a storm. A new woman, one forged in fear and fire, kicked her pony back the way she had come, riding toward the sound of the guns. She emerged from the canyon just in time to see Talon go down. His pony had been shot from under him, and he was on foot, using the dead animal for cover. A red stain was spreading across his buckskin leggings, high on his thigh. He was surrounded. Lieutenant Miller and two of his men were advancing on him, rifles raised. "Give it up, savage!" Miller shouted, his voice full of triumphant arrogance. "Your fight is over." Then he saw her. He stopped, his mouth falling open in surprise. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Well, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look what the cat dragged in. Miss Carter. I knew you would need rescuing. Drop your weapons," he yelled at Talon, never taking his eyes off Evelyn, "or the lady gets hurt." Evelyn slid from her pony, the revolver feeling impossibly heavy in her shaking hand. She held it with both hands, trying to steady her aim, the barrel wavering wildly. "Evelyn, no!" Talon shouted, his voice strained with pain. "Ride, go now!" "Put the gun down, my dear," Miller said, taking a step toward her, his smile widening. "You do not want to get involved in this. I have come all this way to bring you back to civilization." His civilization, a world of men like him who took what they wanted, who saw her as a prize and Talon as something less than human. She saw the flash of his sister's turquoise beads in her mind. She felt the warmth of his breath on her neck in the storm. She heard him whisper her name by the fire. She made her choice. She pointed the gun at Miller's chest and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil slamming her shoulder back with a brutal force. The shot went wide, kicking up a puff of dust near Miller's feet. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You missed, little schoolteacher." He took another step. She pulled the trigger again. This time, her aim was truer. The bullet struck him in the chest. The look of surprise on his face was absolute. He staggered back, a dark red flower blooming on his blue uniform. He looked down at his chest, then back at her, his expression one of pure disbelief. Then his legs crumpled beneath him, and he fell into the dust. The other two soldiers stared, momentarily stunned. That was all the opening Talon needed. He fired his own weapon twice, his shots precise and deadly. The soldiers fell. Silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of a wounded horse. Evelyn dropped the revolver as if it had burned her. She ran to Talon, stumbling over the uneven ground. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the bloody wound in his leg. Blood was everywhere, staining the sand a dark, terrible crimson. His face was pale, beaded with sweat, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Tears streamed down her face. hot and useless. "You cannot die," she sobbed, her hands finally touching him, becoming slick with his blood. "Not now. Not after you saved me once." He looked up at her, his dark eyes clouded with pain, but holding a flicker of the same light she had seen by the fire. A faint smile touched his lips, a look of profound, weary wonder. He reached up, his hand weak, and touched her tear-stained cheek. "You were my mistake," he whispered, his voice a ragged thread of sound, "and my salvation." His hand fell away, and his eyes drifted closed. She held him in her arms, the desert sun beating down on them, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. The world was silent, the pursuit was over, but the real battle, the one for his life, had just begun. Panic was a useless luxury. The thought came to Evelyn with a shocking, crystalline clarity as she knelt in the dust, Talon's blood hot and sticky on her hands. The part of her that had been a schoolteacher, the part that would have fainted or wept hysterically, was dead, shot and left behind in the canyon alongside Lieutenant Miller. A new part of her, a harder, more practical part, took control. He was alive, his breathing shallow, his pulse a faint, thready flutter beneath her fingers. But he was alive. That was the only fact that mattered. Getting him on the pony was a nightmare of dead weight and desperate strength. He was a tall man, all lean muscle and bone, and her first few attempts were clumsy. Pathetic failures. He was a dead weight, his body limp, his head lolling back. She spoke to him, her voice a low, urgent stream of nonsense and encouragement, telling him he had to help her, that he could not die here, that she refused to allow it. At some point, he seemed to respond, not with consciousness, but with some deep, residual instinct. He groaned, and his arms moved, giving her just enough leverage to haul him, half-draped, over the pony's back. She secured him as best she could with a length of rope from the saddle, his chest against the pony's flank, his head and arms hanging down one side, his legs the other. It was a clumsy, undignified way to travel, but it was the only way. She took the reins of his pony and mounted her own, her body screaming with a bone-deep exhaustion she had never known, before they left the small, bloody battlefield. She forced herself to dismount one last time. She took the revolver from Talon's holster and the rifle from the scabbard on his dead pony's saddle. She took a full water skin and a small pouch of what looked like dried meat. She was no longer the woman who had crashed a wagon. She was a survivor, and she was gathering the tools of her new trade. She did not know where to go. The desert stretched before her, an infinite expanse of red rock and blue sky, beautiful and utterly merciless. As she adjusted his weight on the pony, Talon stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a brief, unfocused moment. His lips moved, forming a single, dry, cracked word. "Water, cave," he whispered, and then he was gone again, lost to the darkness of his injury. It was not much, but it was a map, a cave near water. She scanned the horizon, her eyes searching for the telltale green that signaled a seep or a hidden spring. She chose a direction that led toward a deep, shadowed cliff face miles away, and began to walk, leading the pony that carried the man who was both her burden and her reason for living. The cave was a miracle, a small, dark mouth in the cliff face, almost completely hidden by a thick growth of scrub oak and juniper. Below it, a thin trickle of water, clear and cold, seeped from the rock, forming a small, shallow pool before disappearing back into the sand. It was a place of impossible life in a world of death. Getting him inside was another grueling battle against gravity and his unconsciousness, but she managed, dragging him into the cool, dark interior. The first few days were a blur of terror and exhaustion. The bullet was still in his leg, the wound angry and swollen. A fever took him, a burning heat that left him drenched in sweat, his body shaking with violent chills. He thrashed in his delirium, his mind lost in a landscape of past horrors. He cried out in his own language, the words sharp with anguish. He called out for Shadi, his voice breaking with a child's grief. He spoke to a woman named Ayana, his words a soft murmur of love and sorrow. Evelyn could only wipe his brow with cloths soaked in the cool spring water and force small drops between his cracked lips, her heart breaking for the life of pain he had endured. She tore strips from her last clean petticoat, the fine white linen a stark contrast to the grim reality of the bloody wound she cleaned and bound. The fabric of her old life was being repurposed, shredded to save her new one. On the third day, he had a moment of lucidity. His eyes opened and they were clear, focused on her face. He was weak, his voice a dry rasp. He told her what to do. He described a plant with broad, gray-green leaves and a small, purple flower. He said to crush the leaves into a paste and bind it to the wound to draw out the fire. He told her to boil the root and make him drink the bitter tea to fight the fever from within. She listened, memorizing every detail, then went out into the harsh sunlight, searching. She found the plant growing in the shade of a rock, just as he had said. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. She was not helpless. She was his hands, his feet, his will to survive. They fell into a rhythm. She tended the wound, forced the bitter tea down his throat, and kept watch. He drifted in and out of the fevered darkness, but in his clear moments, he taught her. He showed her how to make a simple snare from a bit of sinew, and on the fifth day, she caught a rabbit. She cooked it over a small, smokeless fire he taught her to build in the back of the cave. The smell of the roasting meat, the most triumphant scent she had ever known. She had provided. She had sustained them. The lost schoolteacher had become a hunter. The fever, however, would not break. The wound was poisoned by the lead inside him. On the evening of the seventh day, he was lucid again, his eyes sharp with a terrible clarity. He looked at the swollen, discolored flesh of his thigh, and then at her. He said the bullet had to come out. He told her to take his knife and hold the blade in the fire until it glowed. He told her where to cut. She recoiled, her stomach turning. "I cannot," she whispered, shaking her head. "I am not a doctor. I will kill you." "The fever will kill me if you do not," he said, his voice quiet, but with an edge of steel that left no room for argument. "I have trusted you this far. Evelyn, trust me now." She looked at him, at the absolute faith in his eyes, and knew she had no choice. She did as he instructed, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the knife. He gave her a piece of leather to bite down on. He watched her, his eyes never leaving hers, as she knelt beside him, the firelight glinting on the heated blade. She took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and made the cut. He did not scream. A low, guttural groan was torn from his throat, and his body arched in agony. But he did not scream. Probing for the bullet was a blind, fumbling, horrific process. Her hands were covered in his blood, her tears blurring her vision. Finally, her fingers felt the small, hard lump of lead. She worked it loose, her entire being focused on that single, terrible task. When it was finally out, a misshapen piece of metal that had caused so much pain, she nearly collapsed with relief. She cleaned the wound as best she could, packed it with a fresh poultice of the gray-green leaves, and bound it tightly. He had passed out from the pain. She sat by his side all night, watching, waiting, praying. Toward morning, the fever broke, the shaking stopped, and his skin, which had been burning hot, was cool and damp. He slept a deep, natural sleep for the first time in a week. When he finally awoke in the late afternoon, his eyes were clear, and the first thing he did was ask for water. His recovery was slow, but it was steady. The days in the cave became their own small lifetime, a world unto itself. The hard shell he had built around himself began to crack and fall away, replaced by a gentle, weary humor. She would be changing his bandage, her touch now practiced and sure, and he would watch her with a look of mock seriousness. One afternoon, as she was telling him about a particularly stubborn rabbit that had evaded her snares for 2 days straight, he began to tell her, in painstaking detail, a better way to place the sticks. He went on and on, his voice still weak but full of instruction. She looked at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "You talk too much for a dying man," she said softly. He stopped, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, followed by a slow, genuine smile that transformed his face, erasing the years of hardship and grief. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it was a revelation. "You love me too much to let me die," he replied, his voice a low murmur. The words hung in the air of the small cave. Simple, true, and more powerful than any formal declaration. She did not answer. She could not, but her heart gave a silent, resounding yes. He began to teach her more, not just about survival, but about his world. He taught her the names of the plants and their uses, the language of the birds, the stories written in the stars he had pointed out to her before. He was giving her his world, piece by piece. In turn, she spoke of her books, of poetry and history, of a world of ideas and ordered thought that was as alien to him as his was to her. They were two different languages, two different worlds, but they found a common ground in the simple act of sharing. He was healing, and so was she. The guilt of taking a life had not vanished, but it had settled, transformed into a fierce, unwavering resolve to protect the life she had saved. She had been a lost girl, a stranger in a strange land. Now, she was a woman who knew the taste of rabbit cooked over her own fire, the feel of a gun in her hand, and the incomparable value of a single human life. Talon, too, was changing. As his body healed, his spirit seemed to mend as well. The ghosts of his past still visited him. She knew, but they no longer consumed him. He began to speak of the future, not with the bleak finality of a man who had accepted his fate, but with a new, hesitant note of possibility. He would watch her as she moved about the cave, her brow furrowed in concentration as she stitched a tear in his leggings with a bone needle and sinew, and a look of profound wonder would fill his eyes. She was his salvation, he had said in his pain, and now, in the quiet, sunlit days of his healing, he was beginning to understand the truth of those words. She was not a reminder of the white world that had destroyed his family. She was hope. She was a new beginning. She was the future he had never believed he would have. A year can be a lifetime. It can be long enough for a deep wound to scar over, for a memory to soften from a sharp edge to a dull ache, and for two disparate lives to weave themselves into a single, inseparable thread. 1 year after they had walked out of the desert, Evelyn and Talon had found a place for themselves on the sun-baked borderlands of the New Mexico territory. It was a place that belonged to no one and everyone, a dusty, forgotten corner of the world where the authority of the distant government was a rumor and a man's only law was his own will and the piece of iron on his hip. They had built their life on a small patch of land a mile outside a town called Redemption. The name was a bitter irony, for the town offered little of it. It was a hard-scrabble collection of adobe buildings and false-front saloons, populated by miners with more hope than luck, failed ranchers, and a handful of merchants who grew rich on the desperation of others. Near their land was a small, scattered settlement of Diné, families who had refused to be driven onto the reservations, clinging to their ancestral lands with a quiet, stubborn tenacity. It was a place between worlds, and so it was the only place they could be. Their home was a small, sturdy adobe structure they had built with their own hands, the thick walls cool in the brutal summer and warm in the sharp winter. Beside it stood another, longer building, its single room filled with rough-hewn benches, a large slate on one wall, and the constant, hopeful smell of chalk dust and earnest, young minds at work. This was their school. It had been Evelyn's idea, born from the unquenchable fire of her original purpose, but it had become Talon's as well. A year of peace, of waking each morning to the quiet certainty of her presence beside him, had worked a slow alchemy on his soul. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but they no longer held him in their icy grip. He saw in the faces of the Diné children a reflection of the sister he had lost, and in that reflection, He found a new purpose to ensure they would not be lost as well. He wanted them to have the tools to navigate the treacherous world the white man was building around them. But he also wanted them to remember the strength of their own. So a strange and beautiful partnership was born. In the mornings, Evelyn would take all the children, a dozen in total, half of them white from the town, half of them Navajo from the settlement. She taught them their letters, how to form the strange, powerful symbols that could hold a story or a promise. She taught them their numbers, how to calculate and measure the world in a new way. Her voice was a calm, patient presence in the small schoolhouse, her belief in her pupils an almost tangible force. In the afternoons, the lessons changed. The children would spill out into the sunland, and Talon would become their teacher. He did not use a slate or chalk. His classroom was the earth, the sky, the wind. He taught the boys, and any of the girls who were interested, how to fletch an arrow so it flew true. He showed them how to read a track in the dust, to know if it was a deer or a coyote, and how long ago it had passed. He taught them which plants could heal and which could harm, how to find water where there seemed to be none, and how to plant the corn, beans, and squash that had sustained his people for 1,000 years. But more than that, he taught them to stand straight, to look the world in the eye, and to never be ashamed of the blood in their veins or the language of their ancestors. He taught them the pride that had been so nearly beaten out of his people. The children, in their simple, unclouded wisdom, saw no strangeness in this. They learned to write their name in English and to greet the morning sun in Dine. They moved between the two worlds of their teachers with an easy grace that the adults around them had long since lost. A miner's son would watch, rapt, as Talon showed a Navajo girl how to start a fire with a hand drill. A Navajo boy would laboriously help a merchant's daughter sound out a difficult word from a primer. In the small, dusty patch of land they called their school, a new world was being tentatively, bravely, born. The town of Redemption, however, was not so accepting. When Evelyn and Talon rode in for supplies, a hush would fall over the main street. Conversations would stop. Men would turn their heads slowly, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity, contempt, and a crude, unspoken speculation. The women were worse. They would pull their children closer, their faces pinched with disapproval, whispering behind their hands as the strange couple passed. Evelyn was a pariah, a white woman who had willingly chosen a life with a savage. Talon was a threat, an Indian who did not know his place, who walked with a confidence that they found deeply unsettling. They endured it with a quiet dignity that only seemed to infuriate the townspeople more. Talon's face would become a mask of stone, his eyes looking straight ahead, his hand never far from the knife at his belt. Evelyn would lift her chin a little higher, her gaze calm and direct, refusing to be shamed. They were an island, their love and their purpose the only solid ground in a hostile sea. The hostility, which had been a thing of whispers and stares, finally took a more solid form. They awoke one morning to find it, the simple wooden sign that hung over the schoolhouse door, which had read Redemption School, had been defaced. Someone had come in the night. With a bucket of thick, black paint, the old name was obliterated. In its place, in crude, dripping letters, were 2 words half-breed school. Evelyn stared at it, the single ugliest word she had ever known searing itself into her mind. It was a word meant to wound, to diminish, to erase. It was a brand, a mark of shame. She felt a hot flush of anger, followed by a cold, sickening wave of despair. They had worked so hard to build something good, something pure, and with a few strokes of a brush, it had been sullied, defined by the very hatred they were trying to overcome. Talon came to stand beside her, his body rigid. He looked at the sign, then at her face. He saw the pain in her eyes, and a low, dangerous growl rumbled deep in his chest. His hand went to his knife, his knuckles white. He said he would go into the town. He said he would find the men who did this. He said he would make them pay. Evelyn put a hand on his arm, her touch a gentle restraint. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "That is what they want. They want you to be the savage they imagine you are. They want to be able to say they were right about you." "And we will do nothing he asked," his voice raw with a tightly controlled rage. "We will let them name our home. We will let them throw their filth on what we have built." "We will not do nothing," she said, her eyes lifting from the sign to meet his. A new light was dawning in them, a spark of the same fierce resolve she had felt when she had turned her pony around in the canyon. "We will not fight them with knives or fists. We will fight them with this." She held up her hands, her fingers smudged with chalk dust from the previous day's lessons. She walked back into their home and returned a moment later with a piece of clean white chalk. The children had begun to arrive, their bright, curious faces turning from the sign to their teachers, a silent question in their eyes. They could feel the tension, the wrongness of the morning. Evelyn walked to the schoolhouse door and stood before the sign. She did not try to wipe away the ugly black paint. That would be impossible. The stain was too deep, the wood too porous. The slur was a part of their story now. To erase it would be to lie. Instead, with a steady hand, she reached up. The white chalk was a stark contrast to the black paint, in clean, clear, beautiful script. The kind she used to teach the children their letters. She wrote above the hateful words. She did not cross them out. She added to them. When she was finished, the sign read differently. It no longer said half-breed school. It said school for the brave. She stepped back, her work complete. The children stared, their young minds slowly piecing together the meaning. A small, tow-headed boy, the son of a miner, looked at the Navajo girl standing next to him, and a slow, shy smile spread across his face. Talon looked at the sign, then at Evelyn. He looked at her small, determined frame, at the chalk dust on her fingers, at the unwavering courage in her eyes. The rage in his heart subsided, replaced by a wave of awe and a love so profound it almost brought him to his knees. She had taken their ugliest wound and turned it into a badge of honor. She had not erased their challenge. She had answered it. She had turned an act of hatred into a declaration of purpose. He came and stood beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers. He did not need to speak. She felt his pride, his love, his absolute solidarity in the solid warmth of his presence. They stood there together, the two of them, watching the sun rise higher in the sky, its light falling on the new sign. They had created more than a school. They had created a sanctuary, a place where the simple act of learning together was a quiet, powerful rebellion, and where love itself had become the most resilient and defiant form of resistance. The years fell away like leaves in an autumn wind, each one leaving its mark, softening the landscape of their lives, deepening the roots of the strange and beautiful thing they had planted in the desert. More than 2 decades had passed since Evelyn had written on the schoolhouse sign. The black paint of the slur had long since faded under the relentless New Mexico sun. But the brave white letters of her reply had been carefully repainted, year after year, a permanent declaration. The school for the brave had not just survived, it had thrived. The single adobe building now had a wing, and the sound of children's laughter was a constant music on the breeze. The town of Redemption had not transformed into a paradise of tolerance, but the hard edges of its prejudice had been worn down by the steady, gentle pressure of time and the undeniable evidence of the children who grew up in the school. They grew up learning 2 languages, 2 histories, and one fundamental truth that a person's worth was measured by the strength of their heart, not the color of their skin. Evelyn was older now. The Missouri girl was a distant memory, a faded photograph of a person she had once been. Her hair was more silver than brown, pulled back in the same simple knot, and fine lines crinkled around her eyes, etched there by years of laughter, sorrow, and squinting into the brilliant sun. She sat on a stool in the middle of the schoolroom, a circle of young faces looking up at her, their expressions a mixture of awe and rapt attention. They were the children of her first students, a new generation learning the story that had become the founding myth of this small, unlikely community. Her voice, softer now but still clear and steady, filled the quiet room. The world was all dust and fury. She began, her eyes looking past the children, seeing a red swirling world from a lifetime ago. My horse was blind with terror, and my wagon, which held everything I owned, was tossed about like a toy. When I awoke, I was surrounded. She paused, letting the silence hang in the air, a skill she had perfected over years of storytelling. "Once," she said, her gaze returning to the children, a gentle smile touching her lips, "I crashed into a Navajo camp by mistake." Through the open doorway, she could see the afternoon sun, a great fiery ball descending toward the western mesas. In its blazing light, two figures moved in the schoolyard. One was tall and lean, his silver-threaded black hair tied back with a simple leather thong. The scar on his cheek was a pale, thin line now, no longer a mark of violence, but a familiar part of the beloved landscape of his face. Talon. He moved with a stiff grace, a slight limp in his right leg, the only permanent reminder of the bullet he had taken for her so long ago. Beside him stood a boy of 16, tall and strong, with his father's raven hair and his mother's clear, thoughtful eyes. His skin was a warm, sun-kissed copper. His name was Ash. Talon was teaching him how to throw a spear, the long wooden shaft a fluid line connecting his hand to the past. He was not teaching the boy to be a warrior. There was no need for that now. He was teaching him balance, focus, and a connection to the traditions that were his birthright. The spear flew, a dark streak against the fire of the sunset, and struck a bale of hay with a satisfying thud. Talon placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of quiet pride, and the boy's answering smile was a perfect blend of his father's stoicism and his mother's open warmth. Watching them, Evelyn's heart swelled with a feeling so profound it had no name. It was a mixture of love and gratitude and a deep, bone-weary peace. Her story to the children was one of chaos and fear, of two worlds colliding in violence and misunderstanding. But the scene in the yard, her husband and her son, bathed in the golden light, was the story's end. It was the future that had been born from that chaotic past. Love, she knew, did not erase the scars. It did not undo the pain or bring back the dead, but it could build something new upon the ashes. It could create a future. That evening, after Ash was asleep in his room, they sat outside by a small, crackling fire. The desert air was cool and smelled of sage and dust. The sky, a deep, fathomless indigo, was awash with the same stars he had taught her to read on a long-ago night of terror and discovery. They sat in a comfortable silence, a habit born of years spent together, of knowing another's thoughts without the need for words. He was mending a piece of tack, his calloused fingers moving with a familiar, practiced skill. She was simply watching the flames, their dance as mesmerizing now as it had been on the night he had first kissed her. That fire had burned away the distance between them. This fire was a symbol of its permanence. She thought of the promise he had made her, not with words, but with a choice, the choice to stand against his own people, to lead her into the desert, to shield her body with his own in the storm, to take a bullet meant for the world she represented. It had been a promise renewed every day since, in 1,000 small ways, in the safety of his arms at night, in the pride in his eyes when he watched her teach, in the gentle way he touched her face. "You kept your promise," she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the quiet of the night. He looked up from his work, his dark eyes soft in the firelight. He did not ask what promise she meant. He did not need to. He knew. She reached out and laid her hand on his, the skin of her hand softer now, but still strong. "You kept me safe forever." He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, his grip warm and sure. He looked at her, at the woman who had fallen into his life from a whirlwind of dust, The woman who had been his captive, his patient, his partner, his salvation. He saw the girl from Missouri and the survivor from the desert, the teacher and the mother of his son, all held within the beautiful, aging face he loved more than his own life. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her weathered knuckles. He did not need to speak. His answer was in his touch, in his eyes, in the steady, reassuring presence of his love that had been her anchor for all these years. Under the vast, silent bowl of the western sky, the two people who had once been lost had found something rarer than the gold the miners searched for, more precious than the water they fought over. They had found redemption, not in a town's name, but in each other. The small fire burned brightly between them, a defiant and enduring flame, casting its warm and steady light out into the great, beautiful, and wild darkness. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with one another, and invite you to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more listeners.